Measure J would require 10% of unrestricted budget funds, roughly $360 million, to be spent on combating systemic racism through community investment in health, housing, and jobs. The measure comes in the wake of protests against police violence and years of organizing to prioritize care and alternatives to incarceration in LA County. To talk about how they are reimagining LA, we're joined by Assemblymember Sydney Kamlager-Dove and by Eunices Hernandez and Isaac Bryan, co-chairs of Reimagine LA, the Yes on Measure J advocacy campaign. Thank you all for joining us. Sydney, I'd like to start with you. So you've been involved in the political effort to prioritize funding alternatives to policing and incarceration. How important is Measure J in that fight?
Well, I want to thank you for the invitation to be here, and a shout out to Isaac and Eunices, who've been holding it down across all of Los Angeles County promoting Measure J, which I wholeheartedly support and endorse. This is a great opportunity. It's a great opportunity for Los Angeles County, and it's also a great opportunity for the state. Earlier this legislative session, we actually passed AB 2054, which was sort of a discussion around how do we reprioritize and reimagine how we fund law enforcement and actually how we have law enforcement engage in our communities. Los Angeles County has a huge budget. It's a $36 billion budget. So for the voters of the county to say we want 10% of that to be diverted to go into community-based programs or programs that are actually going to help people stay alive, stay fed, get sheltered, find employment, and live a successful life is really important in terms of how we see ourselves as Los Angelinos and in terms of the values that we say we want to really, push forward.
Thanks, Sydney. So a lot of people are trying to figure out how all of this works. Can you describe how Measure J relates to what you're doing in the state legislature? Like how do you think about budgets both in Sacramento and in LA County?
Sure. So the interesting thing is when AB 2054 was moving forward, which was the Crisis Act to say that we would have community-based organizations respond to 911 calls instead of law enforcement, people said, oh, so then that means the state is diverting money from law enforcement to pay for this particular initiative. And we had to say, no, actually. Counties pay for local law enforcement. They pay for the sheriffs, and cities pay for their police departments. So we don't really fund that, but we are interested in things that are scalable. And ultimately, the state does sort of channel $200+ billion into programs and departments across the state. And many of those are sort of guided by the needs of law enforcement. So Measure J is really critical, because you will have the largest county in the state saying, we are going to be looking at our budgetary process differently. And if we are able to rechannel 10% of the funds to all of these other programs, then in effect, Los Angeles County is saying, hello, California, state of California budget process, take a new look at how you can actually help support us, because we have moved a chunk of this money into another space, and we may need more help with that, right? Maybe 10% is the floor and not the ceiling, but because we will be able to prove some success, I believe, because of the implementation of Measure J, it could actually sort of allow for additional funds provided by the state to go in to support many of the programs.
Thanks so much. Eunices, I'd like to bring you into the conversation. So you've worked directly with people impacted by policing and incarceration. You've done a lot of organizing for years. How would earmarking 10% of the unrestricted budget for those programs help communities that you work with?
Thank you for that question, and thanks for having me on here, John. I'm really excited to be sharing space with y'all. And so my sheroes, Assemblymember Kamlager-Dove, and heroes, Isaac Bryan. But your question is great. Measure J would fund, when we think about what would it fund in the programs, it's not like we're aiming for brand new things pie out of the sky. It's actually really focusing on enhancing and expanding the current services that exist. I'll give you an example. In LA County, our population is 10 million people, right? But we only have 50 beds to serve people in an inpatient center who have co-occurring disorders such as suffering from a mental health need and a substance use need. Only 50 beds for 10 million people. And so when we think about the programs that Measure J would fund, that is some of the type of programming that it would fund. Community-based mental health services, substance use services. And I ask this to people, like, right now, if you had a friend suffering from, a mental health need or a substance use need, do you know where you could take them in your community? Is there someone that you could walk them to somewhere? And most often than not, people are like, no, I wouldn't know where to take someone. I'd call 911. And that's also really important around Measure J too, because the opposition has talked about us and Measure J removing first responders, but it actually expands the different types of first responders. So instead of getting police when you're having a mental health crisis, you can actually get a psychiatric mobile response team, doctors, nurses. What we are calling life-affirming responses, right? When we think about public safety, it should be life-affirming. And so those are the things that Measure J would fund. Services that are going to help our communities thrive and not, go back to the status quo of COVID-19, but go beyond that, because a lot of our folks were just surviving back then too.
Absolutely. So how does Measure J fit into the broader work that's happened leading up to this, right? So there was alternatives to incarceration process. There, stop the building of a new jail. How does this fit into other LA County priorities and rethinking how we approach public safety?
Thank you for Measure J would get a lot of things over the finish line. Like you mentioned, in LA County, we've been fighting a jail expansion plan for over 10 years. Last year, we were successful in stopping a new women's jail they wanted to build in Lancaster and a new mental health jail they wanted to build in downtown. At the same time, we worked with the county to develop a report called Care First, Jails Last. For us, it's Care First, Jails Never, but we'll leave it at that. And it has 114 recommendations on how to keep law enforcement away from our most vulnerable people, how to keep our people out of the jails and ERs. Also, we're in the middle of a conversation on how to close Men's Central Jail down, the oldest jail in LA County. It's a dungeon where people get harmed and killed. And we're also talking about reassessing AB 109 funds. And thank you to Assemblymember Kamalaga Dove for requesting at the state level. It's finally happening at the county level. Millions of dollars, essentially a blank check that could go to fund these things. Measure J would help us get that over the finish line, give us the necessary services to close Men's Central Jail down. We know from a report done by the RAND company that there are thousands of people, over 5,000 people in our LA County jails diagnosed with serious mental health needs that could be better served in community for much cheaper costs and better rates of success if we actually had those community-based services to put them in. And so Measure J would help fund that. Would help us decrease the jail population. It would help us close Men's Central Jail down, and it would actually give us the resources to implement the Alternatives to Incarceration report, which for me, and I know Isaac and others that have worked on it, this report really sets the golden standard for what other jurisdictions can do to expand alternatives and to really prevent our folks from getting sucked into the system in the first place.
Thank you so much. Isaac, I'd like to bring you into the conversation. So we're talking about process here, and a lot of people are thinking about, how can this be a model? So can you walk us back and take us through how we got here, how we got Measure J on the ballot, and also talk about the coalition that has come together in support of Measure J? Oh, you're muted.
Sorry, my internet connection is getting a little wonky too, but I appreciate that question, John.
To me all the time.
Thank you, my fearless co-chair Nisus and Assemblymember Sidney Kamlager, who leads questions about justice in the Assembly like no other. How we got here has been a process, like Anissa said, of over a decade of labor and organizing and work, right? That started with questioning the size and scope of the county jail and the role of our civic investments in law enforcement at the expense of other resources that our communities definitely need. So we stopped the construction of 2 new jails. We launched the Office of Diversion and Reentry. We set up a Civilian Oversight Commission. We gave that Civilian Oversight Commission subpoena power with Measure R. We launched the Alternatives to Incarceration Work Group, of which Nisus was a voting member. We put out the Care First, Jails Last, or Jails Never report. All of these things provided that landscape for where we are now. But to literally get this on the ballot, it took a political window that I hope we don't have again, where for over 8 minutes, we saw a man murdered in the streets at the hands of law enforcement, right? We know the story and the lack of justice in the Breonna Taylor case. We saw Rashard Brooks and countless others across this country. It brought more of us out into the streets than at any point in American history. And it took that political opening for a coalition like Reimagine LA, which is over 150 organizations, to come together, organizations and folks that don't always do business together in the policy space, right? We've got the United Way and LA Can. We've got Black Lives Matter and Mayor Garcetti, right? We've got an extremely diverse and important coalition that knows that this movement for justice in Los Angeles is righteous. And to get this on the ballot, we had to get the Board of Supervisors, which is the governing body over LA County, 5 supervisors, at least 3 of them, to vote in favor of relinquishing some of their own power and authority back to the voters, right? The ability to have a say in the budget. And we didn't just get 3 out of the 5, we got 4 out of the 5 who not only voted to put this on the ballot, put it in the hands of voters, but also endorsed this measure wholeheartedly as a need for the county to set up this 10% in unrestricted revenues to go towards alternatives to incarceration and community care and community investment in perpetuity, forever, beyond their term limits. And so that's really how we got to the ballot. And after getting to the ballot, we just continue to grow, build up strength to launch this campaign to fight back, because we're not without opposition, but that opposition is wholly rooted in the systems of harm and incarceration as we know them today, primarily the Sheriff's Deputies Association and other peace officers associations. Other than that, everybody else is rolling with Reimagine LA and Measure J, and we're very proud of where we are so far and hopeful November 3rd, the voters will speak with us.
Thank you, Isaac. I was going to ask you about the opposition. So can you talk a little bit more about that opposition? And people are mostly concerned about the arguments for and against. So what are they saying in opposition to Measure J, and what's the response been from you all?
Yeah, so Measure J does not inherently call for the defunding of the Sheriff's Department or any law enforcement entity. It's not written in the language. However, you can't really have a full comprehensive conversation about how to earmark 10% for healing and well-being without questioning the over 40% that currently goes to our systems of harm. And knowing that conversation has to take place during implementation, the law enforcement institutions as we know them have galvanized their union bases to raise a lot of money to fight us. They put over $2.5 million into TV ads just last week to run from now to the end of the election. Now, we're a people power campaign, right? We got this out the mud. We don't have $2.5 million to fight on TV, but we have voters all across the county that are standing with us, and we've got a donor base of support that has allowed us to fight back, to be heard, and to push this measure forward. But the opposition is well organized and concentrated, but it solely exists in the hands of law enforcement unions as we know them. And if you go to the bottom of the No on J website and everywhere else where the misleading information is posted, you'll see who's funding that. And I say misinformation because they're leading with an accusation that the LA Times has come out against Measure J, when in fact, the LA Times has endorsed Measure J wholeheartedly. They're leading with pictures of Black women in scrubs saying that essential workers are not with Measure J, forgetting that SEIU 2015, over 400,000 strong, have endorsed Measure J, right? The heart of essential workers here in LA County, right? They're leading with this idea that they're putting mailers out with choppers fighting wildfires, not knowing or knowing that the fire department is a special district in the county of Los Angeles, and you can't touch that budget no matter what you do, right? It's all misinformation, and it's all being propagated by those who have an interest in the status quo. But I think LA County wants to move beyond the status quo, and that we want to do something bigger and better. And that's where Measure J for Justice is coming in.
Thank you, Isaac. So, at this point, I'd like to open it up to more of a panel discussion and give you, Sydney and Aonis, an opportunity to respond to what Isaac was saying. What kind of police union tactics have you seen in this space? Just continuing on this theme of the opposition and how you all are responding. Starting with you, Sydney.
Well, this has been a very active election cycle for so many folks. I have a colleague who is running for re-election, and a law enforcement organization actually put out a video with a literal target on his face and said that we are coming for him. And so how you would think that that's an image that should be shared and should proliferate in this time is beyond me. My colleague is an African-American gentleman. He also happens to chair the Assembly Public Safety. So you see that there are still elements of our communities that are tone deaf to the moment that we're in. But it's also really important to realize how we got here. And we got here because we've had so many systemic breakdowns, and we've had community that has said, fix it. We need a solution. We need a solution to mental health. We need a solution to substance abuse. We need a solution to homelessness. And community members, our neighbors, don't necessarily care how we do it. They just want a solution to evolve. And ultimately, that means that the laziest thing to do is to fund law enforcement, to say, okay, you step in and now you're responsible for all of these problems and finding solutions. And so what you do is you metastasize the carceral system. You expand how we continue to penalize poverty. You continue to create stronger and stronger disparities between groups based on ethnicity, based on race, based on poverty, based on sexual orientation. And this is actually a moment, I think, where communities are saying, we actually want to know about the how. We actually just don't want to have all of it get pushed in this one bucket that's about killing folks or tethering them to a criminal court system from which they can never break free from, right? And so I am hopeful that we recognize that the chants that people say when they're marching in the streets should not just be an anthem, but should be continued motivation for how we reimagine all of how we help the folks that are living next to us that we know that we don't know. And they could be living next to us in a car, they could be living next to us in a home. But we have to collectively do a better job of asking the how and the why we are coming up with solutions. And that's why I think Measure J has such opportunity.
Thank you, Sydney. So Anisis, you want to jump in, and you can either respond to the police union issue or talk about the how, because a lot of people have questions regarding, like, does this work? Does a Care First model work? Can you talk about any stories that demonstrate how effective this approach can be?
Sure. Thank you, John. And I just want to uplift that the calls for housing, the calls for good jobs, the call for health access, like, that's not new. That's what our communities have been needing to thrive for as long as our communities have existed, right? And so when we think about solutions, when we think about the impact that providing services has on our communities, there's decades of information on that. But I'll focus on a new example, which is the LA County, like Isaac mentioned, LA County developed the Office of Diversion and Reentry. And what they actually do is divert some of the most serious cases, not just for folks who have serious mental health needs, like misdemeanor cases, but also like some more serious cases. And ODR is getting these folks who have serious mental health needs, serious cases into housing, and they're showing that they have better outcome rates than people coming out of the jails. The success rate of the Office of Diversion and Reentry is over 84% in their programming, while the recidivism rate in the jails is nearly 80%. And so it's completely opposite. And I remember a couple of years ago where the county was saying, well, this is just an experiment. And luckily for us, it's been one that's been able to prove itself, and it's proven. Give people housing, give people the mental health services they need in their communities, and we're going to see that it's going to be more successful. And ODR has diverted over 5,000 people out of the LA County jail with like freaking pennies compared to what the Sheriff's Department has gotten of our budget, $3.3 billion. Literally, the ODR, Office of Diversion and Reentry, has been doing it with pennies on the dollar. So the ODR is successful. It's showing that it works, and we need to expand it. And the Alternatives to Incarceration report highlights all of those things. Just give people preventative services, housing, and jobs, and we're going to see better outcomes. And just to add, go ahead.
Sandra. I was going to say, to Eunice's point, ODR actually gets a lot of its funding either from grants or from some dollars that come out of SB 678. The majority of those funds, however, go to probation. And so this is a department that is actually being run by really great people, one of whom is a judge who's been in the streets, who's seen it. And why should they actually be fighting for pennies to do work that they have data proves to be successful? And Measure J says, so we're not going to just give you pennies and make you fight for crumbs and look for funding elsewhere, because this is actually something that we all should be supporting and that we should be investing in. And these kinds of programs are actually very hard to get funded at the state level. And so this says, and to some should argue, the county should be investing. If this is a good program, then the county should put its money where its mouth is and say, I'm going to fund this, rather than ask them to go out and find dollars elsewhere, so that we can continue to fund systems that aren't working.
Thanks so much.
And John, if I could just add really fast, is that something about Measure J that is critically important to this conversation, and is a caveat that, I mean, I'm extremely proud of that we got in there, is that none of the money moved can go to any part of the traditional system of injustice. So the sheriffs can't touch it, probation can't touch it, the DAs can't touch it. And this is because we saw that at the state level, bills like SB 678, bills like AB 109 were intended for social services and reentry services going to these departments and getting stuck in those departments. LA County Probation Department has been sitting on millions of dollars of SB 678 dollars that they have not gotten out to the community. And so we said that instead of these dollars going through these systems, we want to make sure that they're protected and they go straight to community or the health departments or departments like WEDAX that is doing the employment services. But because we saw this experience of state dollars getting stuck in these departments.
Thanks, Anissa. Isaac, I want to give you an opportunity to jump in because you've actually done a lot of work with these dollars, right? And like thinking about where money is going, you did a lot of work with $1 Million Hoods. Can you jump in and just kind of continue explaining like how important like this money, or how you're thinking about the money allocation piece?
Yeah. First and foremost, I want to give a shout out to Assemblymember Sidney Kamlager for passing AB 1950 this last cycle, which limits the amount of time people spend on probation. Think of other ways we can curtail the size and scope of our criminal legal system, but also launching an audit of LA County Jail and a couple other jails across the state to think critically about how resources are being used. I think about the AB 109 money that Anissa is talking about that's been sat on for a long time or used as part of a homelessness strategy that the sheriff should not be a part of, let alone leading and well-resourced by the state to lead, right? We always seem to ask ourselves, well, are these programs effective? Are we spending money the right way? And never really questioning how we're currently spending money, right? $3 billion annually on a system of harm that we know exacerbates the social conditions of inequality and poverty. The average amount of time somebody spends in the county jail is 6 days. And all that does is destabilize your life, right? All it does is exacerbate the conditions that led you to contact with the criminal legal system to begin with. And speaking of the $1 Million Hoods Project, shout out to Dr. Kelly Lotto Hernandez and Dr. Danielle Dupuy. They just released a report 2 weeks ago that highlighted that just last year, the County of Los Angeles spent over $150 million just incarcerating Black people, right? $150 million just last year, just incarcerating Black people. So when we talk about how we're currently investing our resources, we are investing them in ways that we know are destabilizing our most fragile communities and earmarking $500 million to $1 billion for us to dream bigger, to support civic infrastructures like ODR that we know are working, to question community partnerships like A New Way of Life, the Anti-Recidivism Coalition, and others who are building out transitional housing models that are showing that if you give people jobs, care, opportunity, and the basic foundations of life, that there's no need for the criminal legal system, especially in the size and scope that it is right now. And so that's really what Measure J is calling for us to do. It's calling for us to imagine and invest these dollars wisely. And there's a transparency and implementation portion of the measure that calls for community involvement, that calls for accountability, and gives us a couple of years to really build out a plan to make sure that we do it in a labor conscious way as well, to build out the good jobs and systems of care that we need and not have folks who are stuck in systems of harm fighting a measure that's good for the community solely because we have front loaded our systems of harm with Black and brown bodies because it's the only livable wage we'll give folks in Los Angeles County, right? And so we've got to do better. We've got to dream bigger, and that's what Measure J allows us to do.
Thank you, Isaac. So a lot of folks that are looking at Measure J are also looking at the LA County DA race. And so one thing that we should note is that there's two candidates for Los Angeles District Attorney, George Gascon and incumbent Jackie Lacey. Gascon has endorsed Measure J, while Lacey says it's a rash response. How will the outcome of the LA District Attorney election impact implementation of reforms like Measure J and other things that are moving on the county level?
If I don't mind me going first on this one, I just wanted to say Jackie Lacey is wrong, right? And there's a reason that Measure J says the district attorney's office also can't touch this money and rebrand itself as an institution of care, right? George Gascon is courageous for endorsing this, but let's not forget the LA supervisor's race too. And just because both candidates have endorsed Measure J, there's one candidate in particular who has a track record of promoting systems of care and opportunity and fighting for reforms and change to the criminal legal system that are rooted in giving people the opportunity to transform and giving communities the resources needed to transform. And so having her in office is also critically important. We've got to look all the way down the ballot when we're talking about justice here in LA County. And I'm sure Nisa's and Assembly Member Sydney Kemler have some thoughts about that as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I wholeheartedly support and endorse Holly Mitchell, who's running for supervisor. She has a very long track record, documented track record of fighting for the communities that will be positively impacted by the passage of Measure J. You've seen it in the legislation that she's carried, not just on the criminal justice front, but also on the health and human services front, and how she managed, even during a time of recession, to negotiate incisively to make sure that California was still continuing to invest critical dollars into those programs and departments that keep people alive. You don't want a DA who comes to the table kicking and screaming about reform. You want all partners. And if you are in public service and if you are doing this work, you are a partner whether you want to be or not. And so you want partners who come to the table with solutions and wanting to make something succeed, not saying, well, if it's the law, then I have to do it, because that's actually what gets us into the places that we're at. We are actually talking about how the economics of how these systems and structures have been funded and have been cemented, and as a result, how they have actually created a narrative that says Black and brown and poor people deserve the carceral system. It's also important to have folks who come to the table who recognize that, revenues are generated because our people are incarcerated for long periods of time. And it does take courage to have someone say, I'm actually willing to, cut my paper because I'm far more invested in the long-term success and survival of these communities. And the DA's offices play a critical role in this because they come to the table with the ability to charge, with the ability to offer up sentences, with the ability to find enhancements, with the ability to continue to come after you, with the ability to sort of offer janky pleas and pleas that you shouldn't take, with coercive tactics. They have the penal code as their toolkit at their disposal, and it is huge. And then you have the County Board of Supervisors that have the pen and the paper of a $36 billion budget and decide how to guide that enterprise. And it is an enterprise that actually provides social and safety net services. So you want those people at the table who believe in and who want the success of a measure, not who say, I'm just going to do it because it's the law.
Thank you, Sydney. I'm going to start using janky please. I'll credit you though. Annie says, you want to jump in?
Yeah, just want to add that during Jackie Lacey's tenure, I worked at the state level to try to pass laws and was always confronted by her lobbyist, right? Who's a powerful lobbyist when you go at the state level. Like the law enforcement lobbying arm is huge, but she wields her power up there and has been instrumental in forcing us to have to amend bills. So that's been something that I've seen also at the county level. When we were working on the ATI report development, it was her office and her department constantly putting barriers on why we couldn't do something, why we couldn't reimagine not arresting people for drug convictions or drug cases. And also in public, is much more, how she touts herself in public is much more different than how her staff is in the rooms. She touts herself as a mental health, reformer, as this is the DA is gonna uplift this. Yet we're still seeing at the courtroom level, her prosecutors convicting people who have serious mental health needs instead of asking that they go to services, right? So I don't know. For me, it's all about honesty and about, integrity. And I just feel like the way that department has been run the last 10 years hasn't been that way. We've seen that her department has put in almost every single person, Black or brown, to death in this county. So, I think that the DA has a lot of power, and I've heard, Gascon talk about him willing to reduce the DA budget. And for me, my values are abolitionist, and that's how I move, because I don't want to leave nobody behind. We don't want to build things we'll have to destroy in the future, and we don't want to give more money to the system, right? And Gascon has clearly said he will work to reduce the DA's budget, which is a strategy towards abolishing all the power that that department has, which is extremely critical. So I don't know. It's going to be a tough race, but the DA has a lot of power. And also, she wrote to Senator Holly Mitchell. When we think about closing down Men's Central Jail, when we think about actually moving our LA County AB 109 dollars to community-based services, when we think about what we can do around gender responsive to get our women and transgender folks out of our LA County jail system, I can't imagine, the other candidate, him being willing to do that for community, right? We've seen how he's acted in LA, how homelessness crisis has only risen, how he's, not done anything around law enforcement accountability. But we've seen Senator Holly Mitchell completely act like on the opposite end. And when I imagine, us closing Men's Central Jail down, I imagine it being an all-female board agreeing to do that and understanding that. I can't imagine it happening with the other candidate. And that's the scary part, because so much is on the line right now that really whoever takes that seat can either make or break all the efforts that we've been working on in LA County for over a decade. So that race is also extremely critical. Yeah.
Thank you, Anisis. I appreciate all of you coming and giving your perspective and educating us on Measure J. Before you leave, I know you're all very busy. People are tired. It's, election season is draining. What's on your playlist that keeps you going and that's going to get you through election day? We can start with you, Anisis.
For me, it's Lizzo, the song Water Me. That hypes me up. I've been needing it too, because it's been an intense couple of months. But yeah, Lizzo hypes me up, not only her music, but also like her activism. So that's what I'll lift up.
Lizzo, check. All right, Isaac.
I mean, I'm very LA with my listenings. So Dom Kennedy and Leimert Park dropped a new one. Terrence Martin dropped a new one. Mozzie still gets some play to keep me going, but definitely not any music to slow down until after November 3rd.
Absolutely. Sydney, you want to close us out?
Sure. Well, I've been listening to some J. Cole. I've been listening to Pharrell's Entrepreneur, because the video is all about the 54th Assembly District. And then, when I'm writing, I'm listening to Her, I Can't Breathe. Very powerful. And, some of my older moments, I might put on a little Steely Dan.
Excellent. All right. Appreciate y'all. Thank you for joining the briefing. Full episodes of the briefing are available as a podcast on Apple Podcasts and wherever you listen to podcasts. We're live again today at 2 p.m. Eastern to talk with Kara Eastman, who's running for Congress in Nebraska. Please follow Appeal News on Facebook and the Appeal on Twitter for the latest news. Have a great day, and please go vote if you haven't already.